I now have enough philosophy-related questions to do another 10 shorts answering some of these, and I actually have some leftovers as well. So keep the questions coming in, and I will compile them into sequences of 10 and answer them and put them out like this. So in the meantime, here are 10 questions a bit all over the map. There is some sort of unity or structure to what we're talking about here, but you'll have to figure that out on your own. Here's an interesting question from someone named Amez. Was Aristotle a virtuous man, and if he was he happy? So to answer the second part first, if we're using Aristotle's own conceptions of happiness and virtue, if he was virtuous, then he probably was happy. Happiness for Aristotle includes a bit more than just merely having virtue. You have to exercise virtue. It has to be active. And that requires that you have friends and companions and possibly family, that you have circles that you're connected with. Aristotle had that. It also requires that you have sufficient means for two reasons. One is if you're totally dirt poor, you can't be happy. You're going to be too vulnerable to the vicissitudes of fortune to be actually happy. But you also need wealth or property or goods in order to actually exercise some of the virtues. So, did Aristotle have that? He did. The question that we want to figure out then is, was he actually virtuous? Aristotle divides virtue into the moral virtues, which most people tend to focus on, and then the intellectual virtues. And clearly he had developed the intellectual virtues that he discusses in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6. Did he have the moral virtues that he discusses in Nicomachean Ethics and Eudaimoniac Ethics and Politics and Rhetoric and all these other works? I think you can make a good case that that he did. We don't know an awful lot about his biography, not as much as we'd like to know. But in order to really be able to analyze virtue the way that he did, you have to be a keen observer of human nature, and you at least have to be on the way to virtue, if not actually possess them, to be able to engage in the kind of groundbreaking analysis that he did. So another Aristotle question. This one is from Rudransh Bundella, and he says, do you think that Aristotle was right to believe that the final goal or end of all rational action is the achievement of a happy, that is, eudaimoniac life? And yes, I do think he's right about that. As a matter of fact, I am an Aristotelian in that sense, and some other senses as well. But I think that you have to be careful in understanding some of these terms. So, is Aristotle right in thinking that the final goal or end of all rational action is eudaimonia in the sense that he's talking about? He thinks that a lot of people are actually wrong in their conception of happiness, that they pursue the wrong things. They are engaged in reasoning processes, but they're going from some of the wrong premises towards the wrong ends because they've misconceived happiness. So, not everybody understands fully what eudaimonia is. And if we sort of shoot ahead to people like Thomas Aquinas, they would say even Aristotle managed to misunderstand some of the nature of eudaimonia. So in broad sense, I'm in agreement with Aristotle that when we're actually well-informed, properly functioning, less messed up than we typically are, we've made some progress, then eudaimonia, in the full sense of satisfying everything that is within our nature, leading us to our highest realization, yes, then that is the sort of motivator for everything. There's a lot of ways to go off the beaten path. Actually, not even off the beaten path, off the path yet to be beaten towards eudaimonia. And I think Aristotle is very attuned to that. The thumbnail sketches that you get of Aristotle don't adequately capture that. Here's a question about Plato by Bora Atale. How can we get out of Plato's cave in this life? Is it by death? Well, that's an interesting thing to ask. So if you were to be looking, say, just at the Phaedo, or, the Phaedo with some of the other lead-up dialogues like the Apology, then you might say, yeah, that sounds about right. Because, what is Plato's cave? It's this realm of sensible appearances where the things are material. We experience them through the bodily senses, and we're tied down to the body, which is the coffin of the soul, right? So death as liberation to then go, off to the world of the forms and actually see them finally unmixed, unalloyed with any sort of material, whatever it is, material, shape, copy, who knows. Yeah, that would be one way to do it. But if you're looking at, say, the Republic, Plato's laying out a whole program, not in complete detail, but a program by which people would be able to come out of the cave. And if you think about the metaphor, the allegory of the cave, they don't kill the guy and say, all right, reincarnate somewhere else, or just don't reincarnate, just hang out with the forms. Instead, they break his shackles, they lead him out of the cave. He's unhappy the whole time. He has to accustom himself through a lot of disciplined paying attention to what's actually in front of him, and then he's actually able to be truly out of the cave when he can see things and perceive the light of the sun. That's done in this life. That occurs through education, not education in the sense that we tend to do it, but education in the holistic sense of, dealing with the entire person. And it's a long process. So Dmitry Andreev asks a question which has to do with existentialist authors, and I know there's going to be somebody who's going to say, Camus wasn't an existentialist. He really actually was. Depends on how you're going to define it. And he asks, where are you in the opposition between Lev Shestov and Albert Camus? Because Shestov, in many respects, out Kierkegaard's Kierkegaard. He is the person making the leap par excellence, according to Albert Camus. He's not that well known, but he's a really brilliant existentialist thinker, and he's clearly a theistic existentialist thinker. All you got to do is read, some of his early works, or read, Athens and Jerusalem to get a clear sense of that. Camus, hardcore atheist thinker, about as far along that spectrum as you can possibly get. I would say that in many respects, he is an even better representative of that than Sartre is, or de Beauvoir. And Camus criticizes Shestov for, and the other, as he calls them, existentialists, for acknowledging the absurd, but then not remaining true to it by remaining within the scope of our experience, being, okay with human reason's revelation to us that the world essentially sucks and is not going to conform to what we need it to be, and then revolting against it. He says that they make a leap, they make the absurd into God, and thereby they kind of pull the fangs out of it. I think Camus is wrong. I think he misinterpreted the theistic existentialists. I think that there's something to Camus' position, but I think that the existentialists aren't making the sort of leap that he's talking about, that instead they're doing something much more like what Gabriel Marcel was talking about in terms of mystery. Is experience absurd, or is experience mysterious? That's the question for existentialism. Another existentialist question by Christopher Dunn. Can Sartre be considered a substance dualist with his ideas of being for itself and being in itself? So let's review a little bit. Say that somebody is a substance dualist means that they're like Descartes, or they're like lesser extent like Plato, because material things aren't really substances for him. So Descartes, right? You have extension, body can be perceived, can be cut up. Bodies can't penetrate each other. Then you have thought, the other type of substance, and or you might say body and mind. And the question is, how do you get these together? So for Descartes, the answer is the pineal gland, and there's a whole complicated story there. The idea is that there's two basic kinds of things, and somehow they interact, but they're really distinct from each other. They can be understood distinct from each other. What is being in itself and being for itself for Sartre? Is it that sort of thing? No. Being in itself is just being, and it's the sort of plenitude of what is. There is no negativity to it. It's being for itself, which is reflexive, which is able to take account of itself, which actually brings in negativity and engages in, he takes this word from Heidegger, nihilation, takes negative attitudes towards things. So it also takes a negative attitude towards itself, and I don't mean like, negative as in pejorative, but rather it is not what it is. So it's not a substance. The for itself is not a substance. In a certain way, you could see it as coming out of the in itself as one of the possibilities for the in itself, which then can sort of reflect on everything else. No, this is not a substance dualism. Sartre is trying to actually get away from substance dualism. It is dualistic, but it's not a substance dualism. So here's another interesting Sartre question. Is Being and Nothingness a serious work, or is it a joke? Or is it supposed to create an impressionistic sense of approximation, not certainty? This is by J. Ingham. And so let me say from the start, it is a serious work. And like all serious works, if you want to understand it, you probably have to put in a lot of time and work to understand what the author is saying. It requires reading, rereading, studying, going back and forth, until you can actually see what it is that they're driving at. No, it's not a joke. As a matter of fact, Sartre was not a particularly funny guy when it comes down to it. Very few of the atheistic existentialists seem to have had a great sense of humor. Is it supposed to give you an impressionistic sense of approximation? I don't even know what that would mean. If by that, are you saying that he is sort of like throwing stuff up on the wall and seeing whether it turns into something, or just like giving some vignettes? No, he's engaging in serious phenomenological analyses of human life and its condition, and he's engaged in metaphysical analysis as well of what our type of being is, what other types of beings are. I think he's off base on a lot of things, but it's meant to be a serious and actually systematic work. There's that question at the end, not certainty. Well, yes and no. I mean, Sartre thinks that if you accept the basic ideas that he's beginning with, which he thinks are derived from experience, you can be certain about some things in that work. Not everything, but he thinks that he's actually on track with a lot of these things. That said, the drive for certainty that obsesses so many people, I think oftentimes it's sort of a superficial level of certainty that they want, rather than what you get by actually exploring great works. So here's a question by Zero She Flies. What do you think in general of Karl Popper's critique of Hegelian dialectics? So I'm glad that he asked me in general for two reasons. One is that it's been a long time since I've actually read Popper, and I'll talk about why in just a second. The other is that I don't really want to get into the details of Popper's, critique, if you want to call it that. I would actually call it just a polemic, But Popper is not somebody who I read much of, or have looked at in the last really 10 years. I had to read quite a bit of him back in graduate school, and I was highly unimpressed with what I read, in part because he seemed to have such a tin ear for understanding other thinkers, and that's always a bad sign for me. If you need to distort, other thinkers and sort of like bring them down to your level, that's because your level's kind of low. And I understand, yes, he was, made into a knight and great contributions to the philosophy of science, and that's fine. As soon as he starts straying outside of the philosophy of science, the natural sciences, I think his stuff just, isn't very good. What I do recall of having read his discussions of Hegel in The Open Society and Its Enemies was, being struck by just how much he twisted what he took from Hegel to make it fit these preconceived notions that he had, and also being struck by, as I'm reading it, I'm like, wow, some people are really going to get off on this. Some people are really going to love this sort of thing. There's stuff that you can criticize Hegel for. I think that Popper's criticisms aren't the really good criticisms that we can make of Hegel. So here's another interesting question about another classic thinker and classic work in what we could call analytic philosophy, who most analytics don't read anymore today. What is my opinion on the merits of the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus? That is, Ludwig Wittgenstein's early work. I don't see it as an important contribution to understanding philosophy, but it is interesting to look at. It's interesting in the same sort of project way, like Spinoza's ethics is interesting to me. I don't. It's not something that I say, wow, this is where I want to go with anything. And even Wittgenstein later on, he's like, yeah, that work, I was really off base in quite a bit of it. The picture theory that I was using. It's interesting that somebody would write it. It's interesting to look at. It's sort of like playing around with a crystal. I used to really be into logic and the foundations of mathematics, and so that was a work that I went over a lot. And I could read the German, so I was always like, this translation isn't quite exact, but how are we going to convey this? So it's more like a puzzle piece than anything else. I think it is great as far as pedagogy goes that students should be exposed to this and that they should spend some time lingering with it. If that was going to be your view of the world, I probably would not want to have you as an interlocutor, because I would find most of what you would say very boring, and hard to fit anything else in. I mean, if you've got this that thereof, which we cannot speak, we must be silent. There's all this, like mysticism. Well, let's read some actual mystics. That's much more interesting to read them than these little aphorisms. But like I said, it's a great thing for people to be exposed to as they go through the history of philosophy, as they're engaging in their formation. I just don't think that it's a resting place of any sort. Here's a question by Mark Smith. Is there much exposure to African philosophy in North America and Europe? And if so, is it an African interpretation of Western thought, or could it be seen as something more uniquely African? So my experience with this is kind of scattershot. I'm not an expert on this. I've taught African American philosophy classes before. I had to incorporate some things from some of the classic, texts in African philosophy, whatever that's going to mean, like, John Mabidi's stuff when I was teaching world religions to talk about indigenous religions of Africa. And I can't speak for Europe. I can speak for North America. Here's my impression. First off, most people aren't usually talking just in terms of African philosophy or African American philosophy. They like to talk in terms of Africana philosophy because then it can cover all this stuff, and it includes Caribbean authors as well. What tends to sell is not so much African incorporation of European thought as sort of reconstructions of what ought to be African thought, or it's diaspora stuff. But Fanon is a good example of somebody who gets cited quite a bit, and you can go to conferences and see people doing things on him. Here's my impression. In the States, if there is any presence of this sort of stuff in philosophy departments, it's just in a very token way, and it's not taken particularly seriously, although it probably does deserve to be taken more seriously. But that's because of the composition of current philosophy. A lot of it gets done outside of philosophy departments, in English departments, or history departments, or cultural studies, or area studies, or things like that. So we finish up with a set of questions from Andrew the Red 1 about Ayn Rand, and he says, do I see Rand receiving more attention in the future? How is she viewed to your colleagues and students? Where does she fit within the philosophical territory? So there's a legacy of Rand being just ignored or marginalized or demonized within academia, in part because many academics are pretty liberal, and she not only lent herself to conservative causes, quite understandably, because it's what she actually thought. Now she's, very identifiable as a libertarian, a particular type. And so there's a clash there. There's like a long history of dismissing her, and so it leads to this cycle of, well, you can't possibly think that there could be anything there, which is really, just typical stupidity on the part of many academics. That said, when you actually run into people who are really like Rand enthusiasts, some of them are pretty fringe, pretty out there, and they love to throw around words like logic and reason and stuff like that. And a lot of that does a substitution for actual use of logic and reason. I'm not endorsing either side of this, by the way. So does she, does she deserve to actually have a place at the table in terms of philosophy? I would say yes. And there have been recent works by serious academic scholars, not Rand devotees, who have been making the case that, no, she's, here's some ideas of hers. Let's actually look at them, and let's compare them to some other thinkers. Let's take this seriously. The trouble is, when we do that, we usually find out that she has some stuff to offer, but she's not a first-rate philosopher. She's certainly not the one that you should orient everything around and take as the authoritative word on anybody else's philosophy. How is she viewed by my colleagues and students? So most of my colleagues, of course, nothing good ever came from Rand. My students don't know that much about her, but they're interested, they're inquisitive. And I think she is going to be better known in the future, in part because academia is kind of withering. Traditional academia has to engage the broader world, and she's part of the broader conversations.